Good day. The last couple of hours in the Ukrainian conflict and in the global conflict connected to it have been packed with news and may, just may, in hindsight or in retrospect, come to be seen as a moment when the balance started to shift and when the Western powers very grudgingly, very quietly started to retreat from some of the positions, the absolutist positions they have been taking over the course of this crisis. I want to stress this is very tentative. I doubt that any such clear-cut decision has been made, but it's clear that on some issues the Western powers have been forced to make certain retreats, even though, as is to be expected, they have tried to cover the fact that they've retreated on a number of points by cranking up the rhetoric and by talking up various other steps that they're going to do. Anyway, let's begin, as we always do in these programs, as I always do in these programs, with a brief rundown of the military situation in Ukraine itself. And for much of yesterday, especially on Twitter, but in a number of other places, there was a lot of talk that the great Ukrainian counteroffensive on Kherson region had finally started. And there were even reports trickling through that the Ukrainians had achieved some kind of a breakthrough and had surrounded 2,000 Russian soldiers in an area west of the Dnieper River. The day passed, we heard increasingly little about these reports, and gradually I think it's become clear that though the Ukrainians did indeed try some kind of an advance south from the important industrial city of Kryvyi Rog towards Kherson, that this attack inevitably came under severe artillery and missile fire, and no doubt bombing attacks by the Russian Air Force and the Russian military. And after quite a few losses were sustained, the Ukrainian troops had to pull back. So it seems that the encirclement of the Russian soldiers in Kherson region has not happened. It looks, to be frank, as if it was another product of the fertile imagination of Alexei Arestovich, President Zelensky's media spokesman, the person who provides most of the media coverage from Ukraine about what goes on, what the Ukrainians claim is going on in the war, in the battle. Arestovich, in some ways, by the way, is an extremely clever man. He is, in my opinion, an extremely effective public relations, or if you like, propaganda manipulator. But as a source for what is actually going on the battlefields, he is extremely unreliable. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this battle, this not entirely fictitious, but nonetheless ultimately unsuccessful battle that has taken place in Kherson region. Now, this isn't the only event that's taken place in Kherson region. The Ukrainians have continued to launch HIMARS missiles at various installations in Kherson region, apparently attempting to complicate Russian communications across the Dnieper River. So there's reports that they made another attempt to attack the railway bridge on the dam across the Dnieper River, and they also attacked a bridge with HIMARS missiles on the Ingulets River, which is west of the Dnieper. Now, yesterday, in my previous video, I reported the fact that the Russians claimed to have successfully shot down 12 HIMARS missiles. Now, it seems some of these latest missiles that the Ukrainians launched have got through which suggests that the Russians still have a lot of work to do to build up their air defences in this particular area. But in neither case, neither the railway bridge nor the road bridge across the Ingulets River have been seriously damaged, and repairs are being undertaken to all the various bridges, the Antonovsky Bridge, which we were hearing a lot about a few days ago, and which now, it seems, is no longer or has not been subjected to missile strikes in the same way. But there's repairs being carried out to all of the various bridges. This bridge, the Antonovsky Bridge, the road bridge, that was the initial target of the missile strikes, the railway bridge across the dam, and of course this new bridge that's been attacked on the Ingulets River. And my own sense is that the Russians are gradually getting on top of this problem. There's also some reports, by the way, that they're building, in order to supplement these bridges, an additional pontoon bridge across the Dnieper. The British Ministry of Defence says that this is a complicated and dangerous operation, which it probably is, but one way or the other, it looks as if, for the moment, all of these bridges are holding up. The HIMARS missiles are not penetrating, and when they in sufficient numbers, and when they do penetrate, they don't do enough damage to do irreparable damage to these bridges, all of which are under repair. Now, I mentioned the British Ministry of Defence, and I'm going to say that my own view, increasingly, is that the major drivers for this offensive on Kherson region, this counteroffensive on Kherson region, are the British. It's the British who are pushing the Ukrainians into launching these attempts at a counteroffensive in Kherson region. More than the US, more even, I suspect, than the Ukrainian military themselves. The British have been, a few days ago, goaded the Ukrainians to launch an attack. A British intelligence official, the top British intelligence official, said that whilst the Russians were reorganizing in Donbass, whilst they'd exhausted themselves or run out of steam in Donbass, this was Ukraine's chance to launch a counteroffensive in Kherson region. The British Ministry of Defence today has published more claims, very, in my opinion, unsound claims about supposed Ukrainian progress in Kherson region. The British media has been consistently harping on this great counteroffensive in Kherson region. And I have to say that I think that they are egging the Ukrainians on into launching an offensive which is misconceived. I'm also going to say something else, which is that I think that, contrary to what many people suppose, the major Ukrainian military priority is not recovering Kherson region, which I think many Ukrainians officials probably realize is beyond their power. It is still to hold on as long as possible in Donbass in order to give time to prepare more defences further west along the Dnieper River. I think that it's the British who are pushing always for this counteroffensive in Kherson region. They want a big story that they can, cover across the newspapers. Ukraine is on the move, it's recovering Kherson city, all those sort of things. Whereas, as I said, for the Ukrainian military, it is the military crisis of their forces are facing in Donbass, which is the major point of concern. Now, in Donbass, there's been a lot more news about individual battles that are going on there, and apparently the Russians have been systematically shelling Ukrainian troops west of the important town of Siversk. These troops are located on the heights and command the town from there, but they're apparently now suffering heavy losses as a result of Russian artillery strikes. The Ukrainian military has now apparently admitted that the Russians have managed to reach the central areas of the town of Soledar. So, as we can see, pressure on the Ukrainian military in Donbass continues. And as I said in my previous video, all of this is preparatory to a major Russian offensive in this area. The military summary channel, by the way, also reported that the Russians have captured 50% of a forest area north of Slavyansk, an area which the Russians call Sherwood Forest, in presumably recollection of the Robin Hood stories. But the Russians have now captured around 50% of this forest area, which has been a difficult obstacle prior to the further advance south from ETHEREUM towards the important town of Slavyansk, the northern part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, which will be where the Ukrainians make their last stand in Donbass. So it's understandable, perhaps, that the Ukrainians are focused on this military crisis in Donbass rather than on Kherson region, and that they're continuing to do what they can to reinforce their positions in Donbass and perhaps further north in Kharkiv city, and that they're less focused on events in Kherson region, but that the British, as I said, for whatever reason, are obsessed with Kherson region, and the Ukrainians feel obliged in some form to appease this British obsession, and that's why we have these sporadic Ukrainian advances on Kherson region, which are always thrown back with heavy losses. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the military developments. If you want to follow these with greater attention, there's lots of places you can go and find discussions about this, the military summary channel being arguably the best that I know of. Let's talk now about the essential, the key points that I was saying about the fact that the West seems to be preparing some kind of retreat. And I want to make this very clear. I don't think this is a considered decision, but they are now starting to pull back on some of the steps that they've taken. Now, let's talk about, in more detail, that agreement that was reached yesterday in Istanbul between the Russians, the Turks, the Ukrainians and the United Nations. And the international media has said that this was an agreement intended to facilitate the export of Ukrainian grain from Ukrainian ports. And that is true, but it is far from being the whole truth. It is not, in fact, even the bigger truth. The bigger truth is that what has clearly happened is that as part of the agreement, this agreement to facilitate export of grain from Ukrainian ports, that the Western powers, specifically the European Union, has had to ease substantially its restrictions on Russian agricultural exports. And we've now had a explanation of all of this from our old friends in the European Union, from, I believe, Charles Michel. And the way in which the European Union has done this is by announcing what it claims is to be a seventh sanctions package. There have been 6 up to now, but the European Union has now said that it's announced a 7th. Except when you look at the new sanctions announced in this sanctions package, this new sanctions package, this seventh sanctions package, you find that there's very little. There's talk about more restrictions, an import ban on imports of Russian gold into the European Union, unenforceable, by the way, and already to a great extent in effect. The British, who run the major gold depositories in the West, have already said that they already said some time ago that they'd impose such import restrictions. This is of little importance. We're told that there's been an extension of the list of controlled items which may contribute to Russia's military and technological enhancement or the development of its defense and security sector. Well, true, but this is simply more of the same, if you like. There's been some new measures that extend the existing port access ban to locks to avoid the circumvention of sanctions, and expand the scope of the prohibition on accepting deposits to include those from legal persons, entities or bodies established in third countries and majority owned by Russian nationals or natural persons residing in Russia. Well, I don't really see that adds very much to what we've already seen. But then we come to the major steps of relaxation. And we learn, for example, that the EU is introducing a number of clarifications to existing measures, for instance, in the field of public procurement, aviation, and justice. For instance, the prohibition to enter into any transactions with Russian public entities will be slightly amended to ensure access to justice. Now, I presume that means that it'll be made easier for Russians to bring legal proceedings in Western countries. That has been, by the way, a deeply disturbing development. But perhaps the most interesting one is aviation. What does this actually mean? Does it mean that the EU is quietly facilitating the supply of spare parts to Western aircraft in Russian civil aviation fleets? I think it might. There's word that the Russians have been able to cannibalize some of their existing aircraft in order to find spare parts, but also, and perhaps more seriously, that they've managed to find spare parts for their aircraft from China. And the EU might be very unwilling at this time to impose sanctions on China, given the extraordinary extent to which this would escalate the sanctions crisis. So rather than have the China supply the spare parts for Russian Western aircraft in Russian ownership, perhaps the EU has surrendered to the demands of its aviation industry and has agreed to allow or to green light, because there's never been specific sanctions, as far as I'm aware, on this, to green light permission for their aviation companies, specifically for Airbus, to provide spare parts to Airbus aircraft in Russia. Perhaps Airbus has been quietly working with the Russians to agree a swap spare parts for Airbus aircraft in Russia in return for titanium. Who knows? We don't really have a great deal of information about this, but certainly we've been told this comment about aviation is there. Maybe there's more to this story, maybe there's less to it than appears here, but who can say the reference to aviation is tantalizing. But then we come to the next and most important part of this, because then we have this statement: with a view to avoid any potential, this is from the European Commission, with a view to avoid any potential negative consequences for food and energy security around the world, note, food and energy security around the world, the EU decided to extend the exemption from the prohibition to engage in transactions with certain state-owned entities as regards for transactions of agricultural products and the transport of oil to third countries. More broadly, the EU is committed to avoiding all measures which might lead to food insecurity around the globe. None of the measures adopted today or earlier in view of Russian actions destabilizing the situation in Ukraine target in any way the trade in agricultural and food products, including wheat and fertilizers, between third countries and Russia. Similarly, EU measures do not prevent third countries and their nationals operating outside of the EU from purchasing pharmaceutical or medical products from Russia. Now let's just unpack what that means. First of all, it's not true, not really true, that the EU didn't act to obstruct food and fertilizer exports by Russia. Maybe food and fertilizer exports were not specifically covered in sanctions packages, but it was always left open whether they might be in future. And that, of course, deterred insurance companies, ship owners, people like that, from transporting these goods. And of course, fertilizer products in one country were targeted, and that country, of course, is Belarus, where the major producers of fertilizer products have actually been subjected to EU sanctions. So in practice, that severely affected exports of food and fertilizer from Russia. Now, the European Union has now gone out of its way to make it absolutely clear that food, agricultural products, wheat, including wheat, and fertilizers are not covered by sanctions, but there will be no secondary sanctions on buyers in third countries seeking to buy Russian wheat and fertilizers and food products, or indeed pharmaceutical and medical products. And importantly, not only will there be no secondary sanctions, but there will be no sanctions on any party that transports the food and fertilizers and fertilizer products from Russia to third countries. Now, note that it will be fairly straightforward for the Russians to increase supplies of fertilizer to third countries, whilst increasing also, of course, their supplies of fertilizer products from Belarus. Belarus and Russia now form a unified market. So if you are going to lift sanctions on fertilizer products from Russia, that means that sanctions on fertilizer products from Belarus have now in effect also become a dead letter. So that transforms the situation in terms of food, agricultural and fertilizer exports from Russia. From now on, there's no question of them being subjected to sanctions. That trade is going to be unimpeded. But notice that the EU has also decided to extend the exemption from the prohibition to engage in transactions with certain state-owned entities to the transport of oil to third countries, to India, to China, to Saudi Arabia, to other places. Russian oil to third countries, the transport of Russian oil to third countries is now specifically permitted as a result of this so-called sanctions package. Now, what does this mean? We're going to come to that in a moment. But it's an important clue, in my opinion, as to where sanctions policy is heading. Let's for the moment stick to food. Now, Vladimir Putin has repeatedly said that as far as he's concerned, as far as the Russians are concerned, the big problem with food supply around the world is not restrictions on Ukrainian food, exports of Ukrainian food. He has consistently insisted that Russia has not blockaded or sought to obstruct Ukrainian food exports, including from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. He said that what needs to happen is for Ukraine to demine its ports itself, and also to for the EU to relax its pressure on Russian food exports. And Putin has repeatedly said that Russia is a far bigger producer of agricultural goods than Ukraine is. And of course, it's one of the world's primary producers of fertilizer. It is the restrictions on food exports and on fertilizer which are much more important in the current food crisis, though I should stress not the only cause for the current food crisis, but they're much more important than the supposed restrictions on food exports from Ukraine. Well, we've now had this agreement in Istanbul, and I have to say straight away that there's a major problem understanding this agreement, which is that apparently several of its clauses are being kept secret. One wonders why, and the result is that we have no complete text. But I'm going to come to why I think that's the case in a moment. But we do now have certain clues as to what this agreement involves. Firstly, the Russians have said that Ukraine is at liberty to export food from 3 ports. The most important by far is Odessa on the Black Sea, and that the Russians will not launch any attacks on the port facilities from which this food is exported. The Russians have not said that they will not launch attacks on other parts of these cities. Russian attacks on Odessa, for example, missile strikes on Odessa can continue and are continuing, but the Russians have said that they will not take military action to take advantage of what they say will be the demining of these ports, or to interfere with the export of food from these ports for a period of 120 days. 120 days. In other words, for 4 months. Now, Ukraine says that it can export around 3 million tons of grain a month. That means that Ukraine would be looking to export over this 4-month period around 12 million tons of grain. The Russians think that it can export around 13 million tons of grain. We can see that after this 3-month period, the Russians expect that Ukrainian grain exports will have been completed. Now, the agreement apparently provides for the extension of this 120-day grace period before the ports themselves can be attacked by the Russians. But the very fact that the Russians have insisted on a time window in which this export of grain can take place strongly suggests that they do have eventual plans to attack these port cities, including Odessa. And in fact, Foreign Policy, one of the US magazines, which deal with international affairs and security issues, says that the US believes that the Russians intend to launch an offensive to capture Nikolaev and Odessa in the first weeks of 2023. And there's a further clue that that may indeed be the Russian plan, because we've just had an announcement that a new brigade has been created in Kherson region under the aegis of the Russian military. It apparently brings together volunteers from the southern regions of Ukraine, from Kherson region, from Zaporozhye region, those sort of people who are opposed to the Ukrainian government. And significantly, this brigade has been named the Odessa Brigade, which seems to earmark it for use in what the Russians would say is the liberation of Odessa. So it does seem as if the Russians are keeping open the option of attacking Odessa after 120 days. This 120-day period is past, and they seem to be making preparations to attack Odessa, to capture the whole of the Ukrainian Black Sea coast. And the creation of this Odessa Brigade is a strong pointer in that direction. So that's the first thing to say. It's a time-limited agreement. The second point is that the Russians have been talking about demining Ukrainian ports. Now, the Russians have consistently said that they have never planted any mines around Ukrainian ports, that all the mines that have been planted around Ukrainian ports have been planted there by the Ukrainian military, and that one of the major complications, one of the major problems in getting ships with cargo to move out of these ports is these minefields that the Russians say the Ukrainians have created, and which the Ukrainians have consistently refused to demine. Now, the Ukrainians refused to demine the ports because they said that if they did demine the ports, then the Russians would use that as an opportunity to launch amphibious assaults on these ports. And the Russians, as I said, have now said that they will not take advantage of any demining of these ports within that 120-day time window that this agreement, for which this agreement for the moment will be in effect. Now, does that mean that these ports are going to be demined? And this is where I think we see the reasons for the secret clauses in this agreement, because it's fairly clear that demining is going to take place, perhaps not comprehensive demining, but some mines at least are going to be cleared, and they're going to be cleared by the navy of a third country, which will in effect be Turkey. And Turkey, in fact, is going to host a commission of Russia, Ukraine, the United Nations, and Turkey itself, and possibly a third unnamed country which is not part of NATO, but which will also be involved in all of this. And Turkey will have, it seems, the role of carrying out some of this demining. The Turkish Navy will have the role of carrying out some of this demining. And the Ukrainian grain exports, the ships with the Ukrainian grain, will leave Ukraine, will leave Odessa. They will go to Turkish ports. They will be inspected there by the Turkish authorities, subordinate, of course, to this coordinating center in which the Russians are also going to be participating, and then they will move on from there to deliver their grain after they've been inspected to any particular place that they are delivering the grain to. And importantly, when these ships return to Ukraine, they will pass through the same Turkish ports. They will again go through a process of inspection. The Russians will have some overwatch role in all of this. The Russians will be able, in other words, through the Turks, or at least this is the hope. Sometimes these things don't quite work out in the way that one expects, and especially with a character like Erdogan in charge. But anyway, the Russians will be looking to make sure that these Ukrainian ships don't ferry weapons back to Ukraine. Now, I ought to say that I personally think that this is, to some extent, a secondary issue, because there's no reason to think that Ukraine is having any problems receiving the weapons that the Western powers are sending to it. It's not getting these weapons through its ports, but it is getting them by rail. So this inspection process is useful, no doubt. It might be evaded, but it's not going to change the fundamental picture if the Ukrainians sneak some weapons through and if the Turks turn a blind eye to it. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that issue in this program. All I would say is that when you look at this in its totality, when you look at the agreement that Ukraine has just signed up to in Istanbul, and you put it together with this statement contained in this announcement of the 7th sanctions package that the European Union has just made, it becomes clear that Putin has got everything which he said he wanted. He's now got unrestricted export of Russian food and fertilizer products. He's got steps taken towards demining Ukrainian ports. He's got restrictions or inspections of Ukrainian ships for whatever that's worth. So one can't really see that this has been anything else but a retreat, both by Ukraine and the Western powers, tilting in Putin's favor. In other words, giving Putin pretty much everything that he said he needed in order to get food exports going. So why has this happened? Why have the Western powers done this? Well, obviously, as I said, it's not so much to get Ukrainian food exports released. This is the cover, if you like, but they need to get those much more important Russian food exports and fertilizer exports released, because that is going to play a role not just in reducing food inflation in the West, which is a very serious problem, but in order to avert the catastrophic food crisis that is spreading across the global south. And the key point to understand about that food crisis is that in the global south, is that the leaders of the global south are increasingly blaming the West for it. The president of the African Union, who's also the president of one of the West African countries, he went to Moscow. He made it very clear when he met with Putin, that he thought that it was Western sanctions that were creating the food crisis. And similar comments have been made recently by the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, a country which is, of course, going through an extraordinary crisis as we're speaking. And other Global South leaders have been making the same points. And it's clear that in the face of this criticism from the Global South and in the face of the inflation pressures within their own societies, the leaders of the West have buckled. They've essentially capitulated to Putin on food and fertilizer exports. Now, one of the bizarre things is that the European Commission says that the Russian gold is Russia's most significant export after energy. I'm not sure how they work that out. Might be to the European Union, as far as I know. But if we look globally, Russia exports as well as energy products. It also, of course, exports food. That's a key export item for the Russians, and or of course, it also exports weapons and all those sort of things. But so I don't see how you can say that gold is Russia's most significant export after energy. Notice they don't say that it's Russia's biggest export or most lucrative export after energy. They use this word significant, which, to my mind, actually doesn't really mean anything. It makes it look as if this is important, whereas in reality it is not. So we see how this announcement of these sanctions on exports by Russia of gold to the European Union has basically been used to hide a retreat on the much more important issues of food exports and exports of chemical fertilizer, food exports principally, of course, from Russia, though also from Ukraine, but undertaken in a way that essentially meets Putin's conditions for the demining of Ukrainian ports and for the inspection of Ukrainian ships. Now, there's more to say about all of this, because we come back to that point about the EU making it clear, or rather that it's exempting from the prohibition to engage in transactions with certain state-owned entities, transactions involving the transport of oil, Russian oil, to third countries. Now, this has been almost entirely overlooked, but what does it mean? Well, first of all, it's becoming clear that the attempts to restrict Russian oil exports have failed. Russia's production of oil is now higher than it was this time last year. Russia's exports of oil have been sustained. They've been redirected eastward to China and India and even to places like Saudi Arabia. So instead, we are getting this idea of the oil price cap, which is supposed to be enforced from December through the London insurance market, supposedly refusing insurance to tankers that transport Russian oil sold at a higher price. Well, the Russians have made it absolutely clear that if such a price cap were ever imposed and made effective, they would simply stop exporting oil. And I think that they're telling the truth. They've said that it would make no sense for them to do so. It would drive the price at which they sold their oil below the cost of producing it, and that simply makes no sense. So the Russians have, of course, ruled this all out. But of course, the response around the world to this whole idea has been deeply negative. There was an attempt recently by the Americans and the Europeans to talk the Indians round to this oil price cap idea. The Indians were clearly very negative about it. Biden went to Saudi Arabia. He had meetings with MBS, the Saudi Crown Prince. That didn't result in any particular agreements. And as I discussed in my previous video, we now see MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, talking to Vladimir Putin about the importance of maintaining the OPEC Plus agreement. What, however, all this talk about oil exports, restricting Russian oil exports, has done is that it's pushed up the global price of oil. And it's now clear that this is becoming a major problem for Western economies as well as other economies around the world. And I can't help but think that this comment about the EU exempting from its from prohibition the engaging in transactions with certain state-owned entities, i.e. Rosneft and Transneft and whatever, the big state-owned Russian oil and transport companies, exempting dealings with these companies from sanctions, exempting dealings involving the transport of oil to non-EU countries. I can't help but think that this is another step being taken to quietly bring Russian oil back into the market, and indeed to make it available through middlemen, to go back to the EU to reduce the inflation pressures there. So that brings me to Janet Yellen's oil price cap idea, because of course it is inconsistent, as I've said already, with the sanctions that the EU has already imposed on Russian oil. It's made it impossible. It's impossible to reconcile this oil price cap idea with the fact that the EU has supposedly already said that it's not going to import Russian seaborne oil from the end of this year, or indeed Russian oil at all before very long, and it's going to try to deny insurance to tankers that transport Russian oil anywhere in the world. Now, this carve-out in the seventh sanctions package appears to modify that point about the insurance. And I wonder whether the whole purpose of the oil price cap idea is to make that formal in some ways. In other words, to allow Russian oil to circulate freely in global markets, except of course directly to the European Union and the United States, and whether again the oil price cap is really just a fiction. It's not really intended to be taken seriously, but the insurance cover will be provided. Perhaps some of the paperwork can be adjusted in some ways to make it seem as if tankers are transporting oil priced at a certain level, whereas of course it's actually priced when it reaches the end user at a much higher level. Who knows how this is all going to work? But I can't help but think that in effect the EU is now working to undermine, to in effect negate its own oil sanctions. Now, this may not have been thought through, it may not have been discussed. There may be all sorts of people who are arguing behind the scenes about this, but there's no doubt at all that the EU in particular, and the United States to a lesser degree, are now facing an inflation crisis. And just as the rise in the price of food has played an important part in all of this, so the rise in the price of energy has also played an absolutely key part. So they've got, if they're going to control this inflation crisis, find some way of restoring supply. And it looks as if, just as they've done with the food sanctions, they're now working towards dismantling their oil sanctions as well. Now, this is all about oil. We haven't even yet got to the topic of gas. But of course, we've seen that Canada has now provided, is apparently going to provide the Siemens turbine to the Russians so that Nord Stream 1 can go back into production. I'm going to make a guess. The Yamal pipeline is also going to start working before very long. And we've heard now more and more people coming forward and challenging Robert Habeck straight out. I've been reading comments in the German media now about this. Robert Habeck said that by the end of this year, Germany would no longer be dependent upon Russian gas and Russian oil. And incredibly, many people, far too many people, took him at his word, and people are now coming round and are increasingly saying, even in Germany, how is this done? In what way has this been achieved? And of course, to that, Habeck has no answer. So I suspect that just as we've seen oil price, or the oil trade, the gradual dismantling of sanctions over oil, sanctions too far by any measure, we're going to start to see a gradual climb down on gas as well. The alternative is a huge economic crisis in the West, over and above the severe recession which is now already going to take place. We've now seen the European Central Bank increase interest rates by 50 base points. They're struggling to come up with a mechanism to keep supporting the indebted countries of the EU South, Italy above all. Mario Draghi, the Italian Prime Minister, engineered his own resignation. He purported to resign because he lost a vote in the Italian Parliament over a waste incinerator in Rome. Many people in Italy are saying that this was not a subject which merited Draghi's resignation, but nonetheless he announced it. He was then told by the Italian president, Mattarella, to stay on. He then staged another confidence vote. By this time, support for him, his credibility had collapsed. He survived the confidence vote, but he's now resigned again, and this time his resignation is definitive. Draghi, in my opinion, has created this crisis artificially in order to extricate himself from an impossible position as Italy's Prime Minister, because he knows that in a few months' time, Italy, along with the rest of the Eurozone, is going to be in severe economic difficulties, facing a very serious recession, and he doesn't want to be around when it happens. So that recession is now already coming. It is inevitable, but there's growing concern across the political system, and I suspect within the economic departments, and of course from businesses, that these policies, that this sanctions war risks creating a total economic collapse if it's persisted with. So we see the Western powers gradually rowing back on the sanctions. They're doing it so far by stealth. They're doing it in a very quiet way. They're covering their retreats by all kinds of other announcements. But that seems to me what they're starting to do. They're starting to do the same, by the way, with military supplies to Ukraine. Most European Union states apparently have stopped supplying weapons to Ukraine. Germany and the Netherlands have both stopped doing so. France continues to, though on a smaller scale, as does Britain. But the latest US arms package for Ukraine at $280 million is the smallest that there has been so far in this sequence. And the 4 HIMARS systems that the US is supplying seem to be simply replacements for the 4 systems that the Russians claim to have destroyed. Importantly, the United States has now apparently confirmed that it is not going to provide Ukraine with the 300-kilometer missiles that had been discussed previously. It's an important decision if it's true. I'm going to come to that in a further video. And apparently the idea of providing Ukraine with Western fighter jets has been put on ice as well. So there's a gradual, perhaps the first signs of a retreat. It's very tentative. It might be reversed at any time. The hardliners in Europe have not gone away, but we are starting to see Western governments adjusting to the realities of the situation. Now, alongside all of this, we've had economic developments in both Ukraine and Russia. The first thing is to say is that Ukraine has just defaulted on its foreign debt. You may not have heard about it, but it has. It's asked for a restructuring of its debts, of its foreign debt, which is technically a default. We were hearing a great deal a few weeks ago about Russia having defaulted, except of course it hadn't. It had just been prevented by Western governments, the US government, from making payments to its creditors, who have not yet, however, declared Russia in default, and who are apparently considering legal action against the US government. But Ukraine has actually defaulted because it has formally asked for a restructuring. It has also devalued its currency. By contrast, Russia has just cut interest rates by 150 base points. It's announced that there was deflation throughout July and likely will be also through August. It's quite likely that we're going to see inflation, which is already falling fast in Russia. This is annualized inflation. It's going to fall a lot further. And the central bank is now talking about clear signs of an economic recovery in Russia across the board. I'm going to discuss that in another program, my next program. In the meantime, more steps have been taken by the West to signal that they're easing off on the pressure against Russia. The railway to Kaliningrad across Lithuania has now been reopened. And I forgot to mention that the Svalbard blockade, well, that was dropped way back on the 6th of July when Norway agreed that it would came to a compromise with the Russians, that it would ferry the Russian goods needed by the Russian settlements on Svalbard on Norwegian trucks. So there we go. First possible tentative signs of a retreat. It's not crystallized, it's not definite. It's far too early to say that this crisis is ending, but we're starting to see the West bending before the economic winds that its sanctions war unleashed. Well, I've spoken for an hour. I'm going to finish this video now. There'll be more from me soon with more developments. Remember, you can find us on our other platforms, above all Locals, Telegram and Rumble. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop. Please also remember to tick the like button if you've liked this video, and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.